Good morning. A great opportunity and honor for us this morning. We have an award-winning author with us who's going to talk about his award-winning book. And guess what? It's called Shot Down. So Steve Snyder. Steve is a graduate of UCLA. He lives in Seal Beach, so that was the drive up here he talked about, braving the weather and Southern California driving. In 2009, he retired from Vision Service Plan after a 36-year career in sales and sales management. He then began his quest to learn more about the World War II experiences of his father, Howard Snyder, a B-17 pilot and in charge of the crew of the B-17 Susan Ruth. After 4.5 years of research, he wrote his book Shot Down, which has received 25 different book awards. Steve is the president of the 306th Bomb Group Historical Association and on the board of directors of the 8th Air Force Historical Society. Okay, he keeps very busy giving presentations to all types of organizations and attending air shows like ours here at Camarillo, talking about his research and his book and his dad and signing copies of his book. Please welcome award-winning author Steve Snyder. Quick recap, the big guy moves forward, this one goes backwards, that's your spotlight on the top.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rob. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. Like Rob mentioned, I had a little over an hour and a half drive coming up through the rain. Glad to see it cleared up once I got up here, though. So thanks for coming out. It's good to see you guys here. Growing up, I knew the basics of my dad's World War II history. I knew he was a B-17 pilot. He was stationed in England with the 8th Air Force. His plane was named the Susan Ruth after my oldest sister, who was 1 year old at the time that he went overseas. He flew bombing missions over Europe. On February 8th of 1944, his plane was shot down. Move the mic a little closer. And he was missing in action for 7 months, but he evaded capture. And then he finally met up with some U.S. troops after that and got back to England. But it wasn't until I retired, like Rob said, in 2009, that I had the time to really delve into my dad's war history in more detail. And my parents had kept a lot of material from the war years. I just wanted to go through that and organize it and learn more details. And at that time, I had absolutely no idea about writing a book. And there are two items that were really significant. One was a diary that my dad wrote while he was missing in action about his plane being shot down. That's absolutely riveting. So much so it was included in two books that are written. On the left-hand side is The Mighty Eighth by Gerald Astor. It was about the 8th Air Force who flew high-altitude daylight precision bombing missions over Europe with the goal of hitting industrial and military targets to cripple Nazi Germany's ability to wage war. It got the moniker The Mighty Eighth by noted historian Roger Freeman because of the number of bombers they could put up on missions, which numbered into the hundreds. And on December 24th of 1944, 2,000 bombers hit targets around Berlin, which is hard to even wrap your head around. 2,000 bombers. When someone were dropping their bombs, the other bombers hadn't even taken off from England yet. The other book was First Over Germany by Russell Strong. Russell Strong was a navigator in the 306 bomb group, and the book's about the 306 that my dad was in. They got the motto First Over Germany because they were the first bomb group in the 8th Air Force to hit a target in Germany, Wilhelmshaven, on January 27th of 1943. The other item that was really significant were all the letters that my dad had written to my mother while he was stationed in England before he was shot down. And he was really candid in these letters. He talked about what bombing missions were like. He talked about what life was like on the air base, what life was like in England, London at the time, escapades of him and his crew. And reading those letters was absolutely fascinating. Okay, we'll get this sooner or later. And I just became fascinated with the story of my dad and his crew, and it became my passion. I started reading book after book about the air war over Europe, went on a quest to find relatives of all my dad's crew members, which I was successful in doing, asking them whatever they could give me about their veteran. I went on the internet and spent countless hours doing research, downloading declassified military documents, started going to World War II reunions, listening to veterans tell their stories. And finally, 3 years into my research, I just came to the conclusion that the story of my dad and his crew was so unique and so compelling that it needed to be told. So I wrote a book. From the time I started my research to the time the book was published was 4.5 years. The first half of the book builds up to the day the plane was shot down, and then the second half of the book is all about what happens afterwards. And it's just not about my dad, but it goes into detail about what happened to each member of my dad's crew, and also about all the courageous Belgian people that risked their lives trying to help them. But I couldn't have written in the book if it wasn't for two Belgian gentlemen. On the left-hand side, and with my dad wearing his bomber jacket, is Dr. Paul Delahaye. That picture was taken in 1994 at the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Belgium and of my dad's plane being shot down. And then 20 years later, on the right-hand side, that's me and Jacques Lelot at the 70th anniversary. These two men were young boys during the war, and they were greatly affected by it. They saw firsthand atrocities committed by the Nazis against their family and friends. And later in life, they became local historians, and they interviewed all these Belgian people and members of the Belgium underground about events that took place involving my dad and his crew, and they documented their testimony. And they gave me unbelievably detailed information about events that would have been lost forever without their dedicated research. So I owe these two men a huge debt. Initially, my dad didn't go into the Air Force, the result of the first peacetime draft in U.S. history implemented by President Roosevelt in the fall of 1940. My dad volunteered, or didn't volunteer, went into the military, went into the Army. He was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington. And at the time, the U.S. military was woefully weak when World War II started. They ranked 18th in military strength in the world, behind Romania. And also, they were very ill-equipped, but you can tell by the World War I vintage uniform that my dad has on here. 3 months later, he married Ruth Hempel at First Lutheran Church in Pasadena. My mother was born and raised in Pasadena, as was I. It was shortly after she graduated from UCLA, where she was a classmate of the legendary Jackie Robinson. I also graduated from UCLA, and when I was there, I was a classmate of Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. My dad was born in Norfolk, Nebraska, and then he moved to California with his family right before he started high school, Glendale High School. 3 months later, or 5 months later, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and the United States was at war. Well, my mom was very fearful. The future was very uncertain. So at Christmas time that year, she went up to Washington to visit my dad. And 9 months later, Susan Ruth was born. Well, at the time, my dad didn't know how he was going to support his family. He has a new bride, a baby on the way, and he didn't think he could do that very well on a private's pay in the Army. So he decided to volunteer for the Air Force, where he could make more money, especially if he could make it through pilot training and become an officer. So in June of 1942, he went through pre-flight training at Santa Ana Army Air Base, and then went through the various stages of pilot training. This slide's a little hard to see, but there were three main stages of pilot training. Beginning on the left was primary pilot training, and then if you made it through primary, you went into basic. And pilot training was really tough. 40% of the cadets that started washed out and either became navigators, bombardiers, or perhaps gunners. After basic, when they went into advanced training, they separated the pilots out. They either went into single-engine planes, fighters, or twin-engine planes, which resulted in bombers or transports. Typically, the smaller pilots went into fighters or single-engine planes because of the cramped conditions in the cockpit. My dad was 6'3", so they put him in bombers. But personally, I think it also depended on the personality of the pilot. Seems to me that fighter pilots always tend to be pretty cocky, have big egos, risk takers, while those bomber pilots tended to be a little more level-headed and team players. Here you see my dad in primary training at Santa Maria, California. That was a huge day for him because that was the first time he ever soloed. Back then, you couldn't wear your goggles on your helmet until you had soloed. Here you see 3 planes he flew in pilot training up top in primary through old, Stearman biplane, and then in basic training a single wing Vultee Valiant, and then in advanced training Curtiss Wright AT-9 twin engine plane. He graduated from advanced pilot training in April of '43 in Douglas, Arizona, where he earned his commission as a second lieutenant in its pilot's wings. And then from there he went to transitional training, where he learned to fly a B-17 4-engine bomber. And then from there he went to operational crew training, where the various members of the team came together and they learned to operate as a crew. And then once deemed ready, they were assigned overseas to the European Theater of Operations. And on October 21st of 1943, my dad and his crew reported to the 306 Bomb Group at Thurley, England, which is about 60 miles north of London. This is what the base looked like back then. The base is no longer there, but the surrounding countryside looks exactly the same. I visited there several times. They have a nice little museum there that's just packed full of artifacts and memorabilia. Here you see the insignia of the 306 Bomb Group. There were 3 air divisions in the 8th Air Force, and the 306 was in the 1st Air Division, which was signified by a triangle. And then every bomb group had a letter designated, which for the 306 was a H. So the triangle H was the symbol of the 306 bomb group. In addition to being the first bomb group to hit a target in Germany, the 306 was also the longest serving bomb group in the 8th Air Force. They stayed on after the war and didn't come home until December of 1946. They were involved in the Casey Jones project, which was the aerial photo mapping of Western Europe and Northern Africa. Probably most of you have seen the 1949 movie 12 O'Clock High starring Gregory Peck. Well, that was a true story based on the 306 bomb group. The fictitious bomb group in the movie, the 918th, was derived by multiplying the 306 by 3. Another distinction that the 306 bomb group had is that their flight surgeon, Dr. Thurman Schuler, was responsible for convincing 8th Bomber Command General Ira Aker to implement a mission limit in April of 1943. Prior to that, there were no mission limits, and these combat crews learned real quickly that they would never, ever make it home. They'd either be killed or shot down and become a POW. So the morale of these combat crews was going in the tank. But Schuler recommended a mission limit of 20. Aker set it at 25, but at least these combat crews had a light at the end of the tunnel and some hope of making it back home to their loved ones. Every bomb group had 4 bomb squadrons. These are the 4 squadrons in the 306. On the upper left is the 367th Clay Pigeons, named by a reporter in England. They got that moniker because they took more losses than any other bomb squadron in the 8th Air Force. My dad was in the lower right-hand corner bomb squadron, the 306 Fightin' Bitin'. I always like to point out the ground crews. The combat crews got all the recognition and the glory, but these ground crews are the ones that kept these planes flying. After missions, these bombers would come back all shot up, and these ground crews would spend all night long, usually in very inclement weather: sleet, snow, rain, slush, mud, repairing battle damage, doing maintenance on the plane, replacing engines, replacing tires. And they took great pride in these planes. They really considered it their plane that they just loaned out to the combat crews to fly missions occasionally. So they were really the unsung heroes. Here you see my dad's crew. A B-17 had a 10-man crew. There were 4 officers who were kneeling in front. On the lower left-hand side is my dad. He was the first pilot, and as such, the commander of the plane and the crew. And then going across, you have the co-pilot, the navigator, and the bombardier. And then standing behind them are 6 enlisted men, non-commissioned officers, who were mainly gunners. 5 of these men came back home, but 5 of them did not. That is not the Susan Ruth. That's just another B-17 that they took their crew picture in after they arrived in England. I would like to point out the nose art, though. I love the nose art. It's interesting that the Air Force was the only entity that allowed their planes to be painted. The Marines didn't, the Navy didn't, nor did other countries. But the Air Force thought it could help the morale of these young guys if they named and personalize their planes. And they were very creative in what they named their planes and painted on their planes. Many times it was a cartoon character, but more often than not, it was a scantily clad or nude woman. You know, after all, these combat crews were in their late teens and early 20s and very young men. The 306 flew B-17s. Of the three air divisions, the 1st Air Division and the 3rd Air Division flew B-17s, and then the 2nd Air Division flew B-24 Liberators. B-17 was nicknamed the Flying Fortress because of the armament they had on the plane. They had 13 50 caliber machine guns, so they could put out a tremendous amount of firepower. And they could also take a tremendous amount of battle damage and continue flying. Again, you see every plane had tail markings. Again, you see the triangle H of the 306 bomb group. And then every plane had an identification number on the tail, which was assigned by the manufacturer. The Boeing company designed the B-17 and produced 60% of them, but the Douglas Aircraft Corporation and Lockheed Vega each produced 20% of the B-17s as well. There were 3 different models of B-17s flown in Europe. The first was the E model, but they only made about 500 of those, and it was quickly phased out by the F model. And then the F model was phased out by the G model in the fall of 1943. And you can always tell the G model by the chin turret underneath the nose of the plane. Here you see the crew positions. Again, this is the G model with the chin turret. Up front, you had the bombardier, behind him the navigator, above them the 2 pilots. Behind the pilots, the flight engineer, and then the bomb bay. And then behind the bomb bay was the radio operator. Below him, the ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, and then the tail gunner. The bombs hung up on the bomb bay on racks, and it was really cramped in that bomb bay. This boy's 8 years old, and that catwalk's only about 8 inches wide, so you can see how tight it was. It was more cramped in a B-17 than in a submarine. And occasionally during bomb runs, these bombs would get hung up on the racks, which would require one of the crewmen either kick it loose with his foot or take a wrench and knock it loose. And when those bomb bay doors are open, you're looking 5 miles straight down to the ground, so that took a little courage to do that. Here you see the crew positions a little more clearly. Again, this is the F model without the chin turret. Up in the nose, you have the bombardier. His main function was to drop the bombs accurately. But in the G model, he would man the chin turret when they were under attack by enemy fighters. Then behind him was the navigator. He needed to know where they were and where they were going. And then when under attack by enemy fighters, he manned cheek guns that were on each side of the nose. Then above them, you have the 2 pilots, the first pilot in the left seat, the co-pilot in the right seat. And you needed 2 pilots to fly these planes, and not just because if one was killed or injured, that you had another guy that could do the job. But these missions lasted 6 to 10 hours in length, so it was very tiring, both mentally and physically. These bombers flew in tight formation, so you had to stay alert at all times, or you'd clip a wing on the plane next to you or run in the plane in front of you and go down. Then you had to continually fight the turbulence. You had the normal turbulence from the weather that we've all experienced, but they also had all the turbulence from all those bombers flying in so close proximity to one another. So the wake turbulence and the prop wash would just churn the air up like trying to hold that plane steady in a washing machine. Then above the 2 pilots, you had the flight engineer. He manned the top turret when they were under attack. He was also referred to as the crew chief, was kind of the onboard mechanic and knew how everything worked in the plane. And he would also help to monitor all the instruments on the control panel. There were over 150 different gauges and dials and switches and toggles, and he'd peer over the pilot's shoulders to help monitor engine performance and fuel consumption. Then behind the bomb bay, you had the radio operator, which was the most comfortable position on the plane. He had a roomy compartment, relatively speaking, and a chair to sit at. And then the most cramped position on the plane was the ball turret gunner down below. Again, these missions were 6 to 10 hours in length, and he's cramped up in that fetal position for hours on end, so that wasn't too comfortable. Then above the ball, you had the two waist gunners, which was the most exposed positions on the plane, and then another cramped position in the tail, the tail gunner. My dad flew his first mission on November 3rd of 1943 to Wilhelmshaven, Germany. It was the first time the 8th Air Force had put up over 500 bombers on a mission. And flying combat missions was brutal and extremely dangerous. 26,000 men died in the 8th Air Force, which was more than the entire Marine Corps fighting in the Pacific. Another 28,000 men became prisoners of war after their bombers were knocked out of the sky. Being a combat crewman in the 8th Air Force was the most dangerous duty assignment in the United States military during World War II. And it was dangerous from the time they took off to the time they landed. There were about 40 bomb groups in the 8th Air located in an area of England called East Anglia, which is about the size of Vermont. And these bases were all close to each other, about 5 to 10 miles apart. So on the day of a mission, you could have hundreds of bombers taking off all at the same time. And back then, there was no air traffic control, there was no radar, and usually the weather was socked in, with clouds, and they couldn't see anything until they got above the cloud layer. So mid-air collisions were not uncommon, where airmen lost their lives. Then they had to form up. 3 plane elements formed up into bomb squadrons formed up into bomb groups formed up into combat wings formed up into air divisions, and all this took an hour to 2 hours before they could ever begin their mission across the English Channel. Then they had to deal with the elements. These planes weren't pressurized, or above 10,000 feet they had to go on oxygen, or else they'd pass out in a couple minutes and could die. And also, it was very cold at the altitude that they flew at. It was minus 40 to 60 degrees below zero. So frostbite was a huge problem. One of my dad's waist gunners was in the hospital 2.5 months from the seriousness of his frostbite injuries. Here you see the combat uniform that they wore. This is a waist gunner. That's not a B-17, that's a B-24 Liberator he's standing in front of. But you see he has his steel helmet on, his tinted goggles, oxygen mask. He's wearing a flak jacket that was an apron with metal plates in the front and the back to help protect him. Then his fleece-lined jacket and pants, thermal gloves, and boots. And then you see this white strap here. That was a parachute harness. It was so cramped in the plane that they didn't actually wear their parachutes. But if they needed to bail out, they had to have their wits about them to find their parachute to begin with, and then clip it on hooks on the back of the harness before they bailed out of the plane. The next thing they had to deal with was enemy fighters. Germany had radar stations set up along the continental coast of Europe, so they knew when these bomber formations were coming, and they'd send up their air force, the Luftwaffe, to intercept them. Here again, you see a waist gunner manning his 50 caliber machine gun, in his flak jacket. And down below, he's stepping in all these spent cartridges, like trying to keep your balance on, ball bearings or marbles. And then the ammunition came in belts that were 27 feet long. So if a gunner fired the whole belt, they said he fired the whole 9 yards, or 27 feet in length, I should say. And a lot of people think that's where that expression came from. At the beginning of the air war, it was 8 Bomber Command's belief that the heavily armed bombers flying in tight formations could defend themselves from the Luftwaffe. And they flew what was called a combat box formation. And this is the box of a combat wing. And then within the box of the wing, you have 3 boxes representing bomb groups. And then with each bomb group, you have 3 boxes representing bomb squadrons. So the theory was that all that interlacing firepower could ward off the Luftwaffe. Here you see another diagram of the formation. It was a 3-dimensional formation. On the left is from the front on top, and then on the right-hand side, it's from the side. You had a lead group, a high group, and a low group. Unfortunately, these bombers could not defend themselves from the Luftwaffe. In the early years of the war, particularly in 1943, they took devastating losses. Even though they implemented that 25 mission limit in April of 43, it was statistically impossible to complete 25 missions. In 1943, the average number of missions flown before being shot down was 6. And the losses culminated that year in October in what was referred to as Black Week, when over 4 missions they lost 148 bombers. That's 1,500 men. The worst day was October 14th, Black Thursday, when they sent 291 B-17s to hit the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Germany, and 60 were shot down. 600 men. 10 of the 15 B-17s of the 306 bomb group were lost that day. After that, the 8th Air Force was in shock. There was absolutely no way they could continue to sustain losses like that, and they discontinued flying into Europe for the rest of the year. It wasn't until the external fuel tanks were added to the P-47 Thunderbolts and the introduction of the P-51 Mustang at the beginning of '44 that these bombers finally had fighter support that could take them all the way deep into Germany and escort them back home. The P-51s were particularly effective. By the time D-Day rolled around on June 6th of '44, they had basically decimated the Luftwaffe. It was just a shell of itself. Here you see a P-51 Mustang. Can anyone recognize this Mustang? That's Tom Cruise's Mustang. He flew in Top Gun Maverick. That was stationed out at the Planes of Fame Air Museum. I'm not sure if it's still there or not. The next thing they had to deal with was anti-aircraft fire. Here you see a flak gun. Flak was the abbreviation for the German word for aircraft defense cannon. And these were deadly weapons. They fired 20 shells a minute, and the shells were calibrated to explode at the same altitude that these bombers were flying. And when the shells burst, all different shapes and sizes of razor-sharp metal called shrapnel would burst out hundreds of feet and easily penetrate the thin aluminum skin of these bombers. The aluminum skin was so thin you could take a screwdriver and just poke it right through it. From a distance, these explosions looked like innocent black puffs, but once these formations got on that killing field, the puffs got enormous, the explosions became deafening. If a shell exploded near the bomber, it just violently rocked the ship. If it hit a bomber directly, it just basically disintegrate and disappear. If it hit a wing, that bomber would just plummet to the earth like a stone. My dad said even though it was so cold at that altitude, he'd be sweating profusely and his clothes would be wringing wet with sweat from the adrenaline running through his body. When they neared the target, they reached a pre-designated point called the initial point, or the IP. And that's when they'd start their bomb run, and the first pilot would give control over the plane to the bombardier, who would fly the plane through the Norden bomb site, which was a revolutionary device at the time. It was an analog computer that could calculate various factors such as the altitude the plane was flying, the speed of the plane, wind direction, wind speed, so it would accurately drop the bombs. It was a highly secretive too. These bombardiers would have to take an oath to defend it with their lives. But little did the U.S. know at the time that the Germans had a spy, Hermann Lang, in the Norden bomb site factory and knew everything about the bomb site. Here you see the bombardier looking through the crosshairs of the bomb site. And once he released the bombs, he'd yell, "Bombs away!" And that would signal the first pilot to take control back of the plane. And they'd go to another pre-designated point called the rally point, where the various bombers that made it through the bomb run would try to form back up and head to their bases in England, where once again they'd face enemy fighters. And even when they got back to England, they faced numerous dangers. The weather could be socked in. They couldn't even find their bases. They could be running out of fuel. They could have dead or injured pilots on the plane. They could have sustained a lot of battle damage, engines out, flight controls shot out. So crash landings were not uncommon, where once again airmen would lose their lives. It was on a bombing mission to Frankfurt, Germany on February 8th of '44 where my dad's plane dropped the bombs successfully, but the bombardiers got hit by flak and they couldn't get them back up. And as a result, that caused a drag on the plane. They lost airspeed and they fell behind the bomber formation heading back to England, and they were singled out by 2 German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. And like wolves or lions on prey, they swooped down on the Susan Ruth, and in the ensuing air battle, the Susan Ruth was shot down. However, both those German fighters were shot down too. One was piloted by Siegfried Merrick. His plane crashed and he died in the plane. and the other was piloted by Hans Berger, who was able to bail out and made it through the war. One day when I was doing my research, my wife Glenda said, well, why don't you try to find the German pilot that shot down your dad's plane? And I'm thinking, man, she's so naive. She has no idea what she's talking about. It'd be impossible. But like a good husband, I did what she told me to do, and I found Hans Berger, and we became friends. And he, fortunately for me, became a translator after the war, so he speaks perfect English. And I found out from Hans that the gunners on my dad's plane shot him down at the same time he shot my dad down. They shot each other down. I mentioned earlier that the book goes into detail about what happened to each member of the crew. I don't have time to do that today, so if you want to find that out, you have to buy a copy of the book. But after my dad bailed out, he came down on these trees right at the French-Belgian border. And his parachute got hung up in the branches, and he's dangling 20 feet off the ground and couldn't get down. But fortunately for him, two young Belgian men, Henri Franken and Raymond Dervan, came to his rescue before the Germans got there. This is Henri Franken standing next to the tree. They helped him down. And these pictures were sent to my dad after the war by Henri. There's over 200 time period photographs in the book, so you can visualize everything you're reading about. They were sent to my dad from, there's Belgium helpers or Dr. Delahaye or Jacques Lalot sent them to me after the war. You can visualize everything you're reading about. This occurred like early afternoon. They helped him down from this tree, and they told him to hide and stay put because they thought it was too dangerous to move him in daylight with German patrols combing the area looking for these guys that were able to bail out. But that night, they took him to the Dervan farmhouse. And that farmhouse is in Belgium, but those trees are in France, so it is right at the French-Belgium border. He stayed there just one night because they thought it was too dangerous for him to stay there any longer than that, again with those German patrols combing the area. So the next night, a Belgian customs officer, Paul Tilcan, came on a tandem bicycle to take him to a safer location. So they headed out that middle of the night. It's pitch black. My dad said it was raining, miserable night. He had some shrapnel wounds in one of his legs, so he just pedaled with his good leg. And they came to a hill, and they couldn't pedal up the hill anymore, so they started pushing the bike up. When they got to the top of the hill, there was this cabaret, little cafe. This is what it looked like in 1994. But there was music playing, people were laughing, people were dancing, and all of a sudden, two German officers come out with these two young French girls. One of them comes up to my dad, puts his arm around my dad, and asks him for a light for a cigarette. Well, he's petrified. He can't speak German, couldn't speak French at that time, but Paul knew what they wanted, and he lit their cigarette, and they went on their way. My dad said they were too drunk or schnockered, how he put it, to pay much attention to these two guys pushing a bike up in the middle of the night. They were more interested in these two young French girls. And after that, my dad moved from place to place to place. How long he stayed in a location depended on how brave the Belgian people were who lived there and how dangerous the Belgium underground thought it was for him to stay there. He might spend one night, he might spend 6 weeks. Here you see my dad with a few of his helpers. He had many more helpers than this, over that 7-month period of missing in action. They put a beret on him to help him blend in with the locals, but at 6'3", he was quite a bit taller than the locals. And the people who hit my dad, or any downed airman for that matter, were unbelievably brave people. They risked not only their lives, but the lives of family and their friends. Because if the German secret police, the Gestapo, found out about it, they'd be arrested, tortured, and either sent to a concentration camp or shot. And some of the people who helped my dad and other members of his crew did meet that fate. Here you see my dad with two women that he stayed with for lengthy periods of time. On the left is Ghislaine Bayou. It was with her and her husband Maurice that my dad wrote his diary. And then on the right is Jeanette Guedin. Her husband was a captain in the French army who was captured in 1940 when Germany first invaded the lowlands, and he spent the remainder of the war as a POW. It was very stressful for my dad. Normally, when the underground came across downed airmen, they tried to get them back to England through various escape routes, down through France, over the Pyrenees, into Spain, and then out through British-controlled Gibraltar. But something always went wrong trying to get my dad into these networks. They were often compromised by, German infiltrators. And it was very frustrating for him, and it was very stressful as well. After all, his plane's attacked, it's on fire, has to bail out, comes down in a foreign country, has no idea where he is, doesn't know what happened to his buddies on the crew, can't communicate with the U.S. military, and he's being helped by total strangers. At the beginning, they couldn't communicate. He had a little French-English dictionary in his escape kit. He did learn how to speak conversational French as time went by. And any of these people helping him could be a collaborator and turn him over to the Gestapo. And he was almost discovered on several occasions that are described in the book by the Germans. On one occasion, he was at the Bayeux House in Charleroi, and there was loud pounding on the door one evening, and Maurice told my dad to get up on the roof. And once the Germans were gone, he'll come back and get him. And this is not a good picture because you can't see the roof, but it's a very steep tile roof. And I've been in this house. And then you go in the attic, and there's this little tiny window that you have to squeeze out of to try to get up on this tile roof. I can't even imagine getting up there. But he spent the whole night up there. The Germans left the area, and Maurice never came to get him. Finally, my dad got tired of hiding. Word came that the Allies landed at Normandy on June 6th, and he decided to get back in the fight. Unlike most airmen, he had that year's experience in the infantry, so he knew how to fight on the ground, so he decided to join the French resistance. His helpers tried to talk him out of it because it was just way too dangerous. He could either die fighting against the Germans, or if the Germans captured him, he'd be shot on the spot as a terrorist. But he felt it was his duty to get back in the fight. There were Americans fighting and dying for their country, and he thought it was that obligation. How many people would have made that decision? I don't know, but a very small percentage. So one of his helpers, Amy Cools, escorted him. They rode bicycles down across into France, and he hooked up with a unit of the French resistance called the Maquis. And the Maquis were made up of small, independent, ragtag guerrilla groups all across France. They basically attacked convoys, disrupted communications, sabotaged railroad lines, assassinated German officers. And they were given their instructions by the British through coded messages over the BBC. And they were also supplied by the BBC through airdrops. And my dad said the information they got was unbelievably accurate. If they said a German convoy was coming down this road this day at this time, sure enough, they'd be there. And that was a result of the British cracking the German Enigma code and knowing everything that the Germans were up to. And there's several encounters that he had with the Germans attacking convoys and such that are described in the book. This is the farmhouse where they stayed in at near Trélon, France, just across the border. This is a picture of my dad in 1994 in front of it. And he stayed in this tower up here. Well, you see these two windows. On one occasion, he was early in the morning with shaving, just had his skivvies on, his shaving cream on his face, and he looked out those windows and saw a German patrol coming up the area. So he had to jump out the grain windows in the back of the farmhouse and hightail it into the woods to avoid being captured. Here you see my dad fighting with the French resistance in 1944. Who took this picture and how it got back to my dad, I'll never know, but that's a pretty unique and one-of-a-kind photo. Finally, 7 months after bailing out, word came that there were U.S. troops in a nearby village of Trélon, France. So my dad walked into the village, went up to an army major to identify himself. It was an element of Patton's Third Army, which had come up through France after D-Day. And they interrogated him to make sure he was who he said he was. And then after that, he caught a ride on a convoy taking German prisoners to Paris, and then hopped on a transport to get back to his base in England, where he sent a Western Union telegram to my mom saying, "Back at base, fit as a fiddle, bank the money, honey," because he had all that back pay coming. Belgium's a wonderful little country. A lot of people don't realize it's divided in two, really. The upper half of Belgium's called Flanders, where they speak a dialect of Dutch, Flemish, and it's rather industrial and heavily populated. And the lower half of Belgium is called Wallonia, where they speak French, and it's all rural farmland. And my dad and the crew members are able to bail out, and the plane came down right around here. Actually, my dad and the plane came down in Belgium, and all the other guys that were able to bail out came down in France, and they were brought across the border into Belgium, either by Germans who captured them or by the French resistance who brought them over and picked them up. And then the Bayous lived in Charleroi, which is right there. And to this day, the Belgian people are so grateful, and thankful for the Americans and the Allies coming to rescue them from 4 years of Nazi occupation and Nazi oppression. And they do a wonderful, wonderful job of educating the younger generations as well. Dr. Paul Delahaye, that I showed you earlier, he formed in 1984, he formed the Belgium American Foundation, and they erected a number of memorials in the area to remember events that took place during the war. And then on the anniversary of those events, they have ceremonies. But the big ceremonies are all surrounding September 2nd, when that area of Belgium was liberated from the Nazis. And they're wonderful events. I've been to several of these. And they last several days. This is a poster from the 70th anniversary. And they erect these big tents. That's just a portion of one that seat hundreds of people. And they have band concerts and lunches and dances and dinners, and they're really fun events. The locals dressed up in period outfits, and the local beer Chimay just flows, and everyone has a super time. But there are other moments of when they have more solemn ceremonies. This is a ceremony at Cendron, which is right at the French-Belgian border, where the U.S. 9th Infantry first crossed over from France over the Wartoise River into Belgium to liberate the country. And all the villagers come out, the local dignitaries make speeches, the U.S. military is represented, the Belgian military, French military. The U.S. ambassador to Belgium comes down with an entourage, and they're very moving and emotional events. And here, you see all these young people in the front row, again, trying to emphasize the importance of the event. This is a memorial to the crew of the B-17 Susan Ruth that was erected in 1989. And prior to this, my dad, like most World War II veterans, didn't talk a lot about the war. But my dad and the 3 other members of the crew that were still living at the time went over for the dedication. And there my dad was reunited with all these people that helped him and revisited these places where he stayed. And that brought it all back, and he started talking about it. And then 5 years later, I made my first to Belgium with my dad. Here you see my dad at the dedication of the memorial. Here you have Dr. Delahaye that I've talked about a little earlier, my dad. This is Jeanette Godin, who was in that earlier photo. This is Nellie Telcan. She was the wife of that Belgium customs officer, Paul Telcan, that came on the tandem bike. A couple of months after he helped my dad, he was arrested by the Gestapo, tortured, and sent to prison. He narrowly escaped being executed. But because of the beatings he took on his head, he developed a brain tumor and died just a few years after the end of the war. And then this other gentleman in the raincoat, that's the other man who helped my dad down from the trees after he bailed out, Raymond Dervan. As I mentioned, I made my first trip to Belgium in 1994 with my parents, and that's when it became personal for me, because I met a couple of my dad's helpers and went around all these places and saw where he was hidden and where other events of the story took place. Here you see me, a little younger than I am now, more hair. My dad is my mother. And then next to my mother is my other sister, Nancy. Nancy was born while my dad was missing in action. So that was really tough on my mom. Her husband gets shot down, missing in action, and she's back in Pasadena, California with a 1-year-old daughter, Susan, and then infant Nancy, never knowing whether she'd see her husband again. I've been to Belgium 7 times, going back for an 8th time this June. On 2 of those occasions, I continued on to Munich, Germany, to visit that German Luftwaffe pilot that shot down my dad, Hans Berger. Like I said, we became friends. Here we are in his apartment. He shot down 7 B-17s and 1 Spitfire, and he was shot down 3 times himself. Almost all his friends died during the war. I think the only reason that Hans made it, that at the beginning of 1945, he was pulled out of combat to become a test pilot. Heinkel HE-162 single-engine jet fighter that the Germans were trying to perfect, which they never did. But I think that saved his life. If he had kept on flying combat against the 8th Air Force, he probably would have been killed. But when I went back for the 80th anniversary last year for the liberation ceremonies, I had hoped, was planning on seeing Hans one last time, but he died in January of last year at age 100 before I could see him one last time. And here we are at the Hofbrauhaus in Munich having a cold one. Here you see my dad and I at the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. He wanted to see this before he died. I accompanied him in 2004 to a trip back east for the Air Force's Escape and Evasion Society. And so we went down there. We had a wonderful time. And that was the last trip he ever took. My dad wasn't the last crewman to die, but he was the oldest at age 91. And today, all the World War II veterans are past 90, you know, they're hit 100 in their early hundreds. At the end of World War, there are 16 million veterans, men who fought in World War II. And as you can see from this graph, that number has been dwindling rapidly over the years. And today there's less than 0.5% of these men still with us. There was no other event in history that affected more people than World War II. 60 million people died, millions more were wounded, millions more were left homeless and displaced. It changed the course of America and the world forever. And the brave young men who fought and died for freedom are, to me, the greatest generation, and their sacrifice must never be forgotten. It's our duty to remember. Thank you. Yeah, I'd be glad to take any questions if you have some.
I'm going to request, if you have a question, please raise your hand. Let me come around so you can ask your question into the microphone here.
It showed that the bombardier and the navigator, I believe, are up in the nose, and they have the ability with machine guns to shoot at enemy fighters. But since their main job was not shooting, how effective were they?
Well, the question was how effective were the guns in the nose that the navigator fired and the bombardier? The cheek guns were not effective at all. They had very limited range. The bombardier, though, firing the chin turret, that was effective. They found out from the F model that the Germans would attack from head on, and they had no defense. These formations had no defense. So that was one of the major innovations with the G models. They put that chin turret, so they had a firepower. So these German fighters just couldn't have free rein to come in from the front. So the chin turret was definitely effective.
How much training did they get at shooting as opposed to navigating or dropping bombs?
Well, everyone but the pilots got gunnery training in addition to their, training as a bombardier or a navigator. But like even the gunners, it was kind of learn on the job, a lot of it as well. But it was a lot easier if a fighter came in head on. It was really dangerous for the German pilots once they had that chin turret, because they're in a direct line of fire that whole time coming. Same thing for in the tail. If you're coming from the tail, that tail gunner has you in his sights the whole time. So it's a lot easier to find than the waist gunners. The waist gunners, those planes are just flying by in a split second. So trying to hit them from a waist gun was really difficult.
Okay, question over here. While I'm walking over there, Steve, you showed that pilot training slide, and then you talked about how vital flying formation was. So when in that would your dad have learned how to fly formation in the B-17?
Well, they did formation flying, in the States before they went over, but that was a lot different. Most of these bases for pilot training, like was in Texas or, real dry climates. The weather was perfect, no clouds. They're flying at 5,000 feet. And then they get over to, no enemy fighters or flak and then once you get over to Europe and it's all clouds and you have all these bombers flying in real tight formations with enemy fighters flying at it, it's a whole different thing. So even though they did get formation flying in the U.S., when they weren't flying combat, they flew training. They did training constantly in England. Most of that was formation flying, because on the missions that you hear that they lost lots of bombers, and some bomb groups flew better formations than others. And the ones that took, they always talk about the bloody 100th, and a lot of you probably seen the series Masters of the Air. Well, the reason they took such losses because they flew real loose formations, and that allowed the enemy fighters to come in and pick them off. It wasn't that, so my dad talked about that a lot. In fact, he flew over to visit some friends at another bomb group, the 305th, and he commented, and it's in the book, that how, lousy formations they flew in that bomb group because they were just way too far apart. I mean, you tried to get almost, wingtip to wingtip. One thing I'll mention, that after my dad got back to England, they sent him home to the States to become a B-17 flight instructor. They had a rule at the time that if you were shot down and aided by the underground, you couldn't go back into combat, because they thought if you were shot down a second time, captured by the Germans and tortured, that you'd give up the identity of the people that helped you the first time. The only exception to that was Chuck Yeager, who personally met with General Eisenhower and talked him into going back into combat.
Steve, thank you for the talk. Just a quick comment. My uncle was a flight engineer in the very same era and finished his 25th mission in December of '43. And he flew an F series, and his comment was, when they saw who was going to fly that mission, if they saw a G series plane, they flew slower than an F, and they only could fly as fast as the slowest plane, and they'd be over enemy territory, and somehow he survived 25 missions.
Oh, wonderful. I don't know if you heard that, but he's talking about, it was a relative, uncle. He was flying in the F model, and in formations, if he saw a G model flying, he'd duck in behind the G model because they had that front chin turret. Smart man. And that the mission limit was set at 25 in April of '43, but then when Jimmy Doolittle took over command of the 8th Air Force in January of '44, he eventually raised it to 30 and then 35. And that was because, the fighters, particularly the P-51, had decimated the Luftwaffe, and so, you had to worry about flak and aircraft fire, but you didn't have the German fighters to worry about anymore.
A quick question is, when your dad actually did bail out, did he tell you like what altitude he bailed out at, and was he the last one out, which probably should have been the way it worked, but did he have time, because I don't know what the situation was he turning or was he going straight down, that he actually was able to, I guess, go out of the bomb bay, is how he went out of the plane?
Yeah. This is in his diary that's all in the plane. He describes it, how he bailed out and what it was thinking, but he was the one, as commander of the plane, he was the last one to bail out of the plane. And that's another thing to kind of consider. These air crews, they never got any practice of jumping out of an airplane. They only did it once, and that's when they were shot down, unlike a paratrooper that would, practice jumping out of a plane. So, I mean, all these guys are going, I hope my chute opens, or, and they were told, they had classroom instruction on how to bail out of a plane. But then you have to try to remember that in a split second when your plane's on fire and guys are injured in the plane or dead. And, so he bailed out, but it's all in the book that he describes it. But he counted I forget, it was like 10 seconds or 20 seconds, and then he couldn't see anything on the ground. And then once he could make out objects on the ground, like houses or trees, then he pulled the cord.
And he did have a map with him, didn't he? Of the area?
Yeah, in the escape kit, you had that little dictionary, you had a silk map of Western Europe, you had some money, some French money, Dutch money, German money, you had a little compass, you had a small little first aid kit, and I think also maybe some rations.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Okay.
The three crew members that were interrogated and then killed, wasn't policy to turn the guys over after to an interrogation spot, or these guys just wanted to shoot the Americans?
We have somebody who's read the book. I don't know whether I should answer that. I want all these people to buy a copy. I don't want to give away the plot. Yes, you are correct, though. I'll just say that. No, that was totally against the Geneva Convention. Yeah.
What did your father do after the war?
He did a bunch of different things. He owned a restaurant in Pasadena for 10 years, Snyder's, on Colorado Boulevard, which was fun because the Rose Parade always came by, and I used to get up on the roof when I was a kid and watch the Rose Parade going by. And then he sold the restaurant, and he got into various different sold all different types of stuff. But then finally, I guess his career job ended up working with Acra Stamp Machine Company back in the days when there were redemption stamps. There's some of you who are old enough in here that can remember the redemption stamps, S&H or blue chip stamps. Acra made these stamp dispensers. You dial them like a telephone, and they sold them to grocery stores or gas stations, and so you dial them and the redemption stamps would come out. That's what he retired from.
If I could, thanks a lot. Phenomenal. Your best source of data, your research, you talked about going to DOD and whatnot, but you had a lot of personal documents, but what was your best public source?
I was so blessed to know so much detail about what happened to my dad and other members of the crew. Most people I talk to, and I talk to a lot of people, know hardly anything about their vet because their vet didn't talk about it. But going over to Belgium with most of it's all based on firsthand testimony. Well, all of the book is based on firsthand testimony by the people who were involved at the events. I didn't make up one iota of any of the story. What I added was just lots of historical and information and anecdotes about the war and surrounding the war to put it in context. But as far as declassified stuff, the bomb group diaries, squadron diaries, they give like a day-by-day description of each mission. Those were very helpful. A lot of the other things you can get, I already had. If they evaded, there's E&E reports that are available. If they're shot down, there's MAC reports, missing in action crew reports, MACR reports. If you're shot down, those are available. But that would be about it.
Thanks. And then
None of those really added much to my dad's story. They just added more to surrounding background.
right, you've got a lot of detail. So
Yeah, again, Dr. Paul Delahaye and Jacques Lelot, unbelievable the research they did.
So you were talking about the French resistance having so much excellent intel and communicating it, but back then, no cell phones. Any hint in your research as to how these folks were?
They had radios,
good at it.
they had radios, two-way radios. You've probably seen some movies about the resistance, and they had a radio guy who would, radio England and get messages back and forth. But that was very dangerous, because if you were a radio operator in the resistance, your days were numbered. You didn't live that long, because the Germans had these trucks with radars on the top, and they'd go around and they'd pinpoint you. And I've read a lot of books about the resistance. So that's how they got their messages.
Thanks.
It was either the group itself, or they were civilians that would have a two-way, would have a radio, and they would relay to the actual fighters. I kind of look at the resistance being the guys who really fought against the Germans, whereas the underground, they just made things difficult for the Germans. They didn't physically fight against the Germans, but they would hide downed airmen, or try to disrupt what the Nazis were trying to do.
General question. By the way, thank you. Excellent presentation. This is a general question. Friendly fire in that tight a formation, was there a lot of problems between the B-17s themselves actually firing the 50 calibers into their wingmen? Do you have any information about that?
There's not a lot of information about that. A lot of the guns had, I don't know what you'd call
Limiters?
limiters. Yeah, like you couldn't, your field of fire was only so much that would reduce that. And I'm sure there was some friendly fire, but I've never been able to find anything that was definitive on it.
Thank you.
If anyone wants to buy a book, they're $25 cash or a credit card. Thank you very much.